Welcome back to your newest obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. I'm your host, Austin Marie, and I am so glad you're here. This space exists to normalize the neurodivergent experience, explore nervous system healing, and create conversations that help us come back home to ourselves. Because the more we understand how we are wired, the less we believe we were ever broken. Today, I want to talk about a rather niche part of being neurodivergent, and that is when you don't, quote, look neurodivergent. I have gotten so many negative comments across social media, but one stuck out to me the other day. Someone told me that I was cosplaying being neurodivergent. This isn't the first time that I've had this happen, and I feel like growing up undiagnosed has only compounded this sensitivity. Having all of my sensitivities dismissed and my struggles framed as personal failures set me up to expect not to be believed and to feel this constant need to defend and explain myself. When you live your life without understanding what all of these pieces mean, the big picture never really comes into view. And if you grew up undiagnosed, it can feel weird taking up space in neurodivergent spaces. So when people say you don't look neurodivergent, you can easily begin to doubt your own experiences. Maybe I am just being dramatic. Maybe I think I'm experiencing the same struggles, but it's actually not at the level it needs to be to count. And this fear alone can stop someone from pursuing the long, frustrating journey of getting officially diagnosed. And that's only if you're someone who has the financial ability to even access that process. So grab your weighted blanket, your favorite drink, and settle in. Let's get into it. So what does it even mean to look neurodivergent? Like, if we really pause on that for a second, what are people actually expecting to see? Because when people say things like that, what they're really revealing is that they have a very specific, very narrow image in their mind of what neurodivergence is supposed to look like. And if you don't match that image, then your experience becomes questionable to them. And historically, that image has been based on a very limited understanding of neurodivergence. Most of the early research and diagnostic criteria, especially for things like autism, were based on young boys, young white boys, boys who presented in very external, very visible ways. So what happened is that became the baseline. That becomes what people recognize. So if you are verbal, if you are socially aware, if you can make eye contact, or if you can hold a conversation, if it looks like you can just exist in the world, that looks functional, people assume you're fine. But what they're not seeing is everything that's happening underneath that. And there's actually research around something called masking or camouflaging, where neurodivergent people learn how to perform neurotypical behavior in order to be accepted or to avoid negative consequences. And this isn't just like, oh, I'm being a little fake. This is full body adaptation. This is studying how other people talk and mirroring it. This is rehearsing conversations in your head before you say them. This is forcing eye contact even when it feels uncomfortable. This is suppressing stimming, suppressing reactions, suppressing your needs. And over time, you get really good at it. So good that other people don't see anything wrong. But the cost of that is that no one sees how hard you're working just to exist. And then when you finally do start to talk about it, when you do start to name your experience, when you start to say, hey, I think my brain actually works differently, people respond with doubt or dismissal or comments that are super helpful, like you're just trying to label yourself, or you don't look neurodivergent, or in my case, you're cosplaying. And I think what's so frustrating about it is that it completely ignores the reality that the ability to mask often determines whether or not you are believed. The people who are struggling the most internally are often the ones who are the least recognized. And that creates this really confusing dynamic where you start questioning yourself. Because if everyone around you is telling you that you seem fine, then you start wondering if maybe they're right. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I am being dramatic. Maybe this isn't real. And that self doubt can be so loud, especially if you grew up in an environment where your experiences were already being dismissed. Because then it's not just about what people are saying now, it's reinforcing something that's been happening your entire life, where your reality doesn't quite match what other people are telling you is true. And that disconnect is so disorienting because you feel it in your body. You live it every day. You know something is different, but you don't have the language for it, or you didn't have the support for it, or you just didn't have the access to a diagnosis. So you end up in this in between space, not fully seen by neurotypical spaces, but also not feeling like you're allowed to take up space in neurodivergent ones. And that's where I think a lot of people get stuck because there's this unspoken idea that in order to claim neurodivergence, you have to prove it. You have to have a diagnosis. You have to have visible struggles. You have to meet someone else's criteria of what it looks like to them. And if you don't, then you're questioned. So here's the hard reality. Access to diagnosis is not equal. Getting assessed for things like ADHD or autism as an adult can cost thousands of dollars. It can take months, sometimes years, to even get in front of the right person. And if you're a parent or you're already overwhelmed or you're just trying to survive financially, that's not always realistic. Not to mention the immense amount of executive functioning that is required to do all the research, make all the calls, and then remember all the details to be able to move forward with that process. But now with social media and the ability to do our own research, you are now in this position where you know yourself. You've done the research. You've reflected back on your experiences. You've connected patterns that finally make things make sense. But because you don't have that formal validation, people feel entitled to question you. And that is such a strange place to be, to know something about yourself and still feel like you don't have permission to say it out loud. And I think we need to talk about that more and normalize and value people's lived experiences. Because the goal here is not to collect labels. The goal is understanding. The goal is having language for your experience so that you can actually support and advocate for yourself in a way that works for your brain and your nervous system. And you don't need to be visibly struggling to deserve that. You don't need to be falling apart in front of other people to have your experience be valid. You do not need to prove your pain in order for it to count because struggling quietly is still struggling, and functioning does not equal thriving. Now I want to ground this in the research I mentioned earlier, because this experience of not being believed or being told you don't look neurodivergent is not just something people are making up. There is actual research that explains why this happens. One of the main researchers in this area is Laura Hull, a British psychologist and researcher whose work focuses on autism, mental health, and gender. She's best known for her research on social camouflaging, which is another way of describing masking. And what her research found is that many neurodivergent people, especially autistic individuals, learn how to actively adapt their behavior in order to appear more neurotypical in social situations. And this isn't something that people are doing for fun. This is not someone deciding to pretend to be something they're not. This is something that develops over time, often starting in childhood as a response to social pressure, rejection, confusion, or even subtle feedback that who you are naturally isn't quite right. So what ends up happening is that people start studying social interactions. They start observing how other people communicate. They learn what facial expressions are expected. They learn when to laugh, how long to hold eye contact, and how to respond in conversation. And then they replicate it. Not because it's natural to them, but because it works. We do it because it makes other people more comfortable. It reduces negative reactions, and it helps us move through the world with less friction. And over time, this becomes so practiced that it can look effortless from the outside. But as we know, internally, it's not effortless at all. It's constant monitoring. It's constant adjusting. It's thinking about how you're coming across while you're in the middle of trying to exist in a conversation. Laura Hull's research specifically found that this kind of masking is associated with increased anxiety, increased depression, increased exhaustion, and even a loss of sense of identity, which makes sense. Because if you are constantly filtering yourself, adjusting yourself, performing in a way that feels more acceptable, at some point, you start to lose track of what is actually you and what is the version of you that you created to survive. And that's how we tie it into what we're talking about today. Because the people who are the most skilled at masking are the same people who are overlooked or not believed. So the system ends up missing the very people who have spent their entire lives trying to adapt to it. And when those people finally start to speak up about their experience, they're told they're exaggerating or trying to label themselves. And that's not just frustrating, it's deeply invalidating. What you're actually looking at is not someone pretending. You're looking at someone who has spent years learning how to survive in a world that wasn't built for their brain. Another voice in this conversation that I think is really important is Devon Price, an American social psychologist, writer, and educator known for work on neurodiversity, self-compassion, and productivity culture. Price's writing explores how social expectations shape identity, particularly for autistic and transgender individuals. Price's work pulls together both research and lived experience in a way that helps explain why so many people are only now recognizing their neurodivergence in adulthood. One of the core ideas Price talks about is that a lot of neurodivergent people were missed, not because they didn't have traits, but because they didn't match the stereotype. Because they were verbal, they were intelligent, they were compliant, or because they were socialized, especially as women or marginalized groups, to be accommodating, agreeable, and easy to manage. So instead of being identified and supported, they adapted. They became the good kid, the high achiever, the one who held it together. But that adaptation often came at a cost, because underneath that, there was still confusion and overwhelm. There was still sensory difficulties and difficulty with executive functioning. It just wasn't visible in a way that other people recognized. And what Devon Price really highlights is that this creates a generation of people who grow up without language for their experience. So instead of understanding themselves through the lens of neurodivergence, they understand themselves through the lens of personal failure. I'm too sensitive. I'm too much. I'm not trying hard enough, which, if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what so many of us were told growing up. And when you combine that with masking, it creates this really complicated internal experience. Because on one hand, you are functioning, you are surviving, you are meeting expectations, at least on the surface. But on the other hand, you are struggling in ways that don't have language, don't have validation, and don't have support. And that disconnect is what makes it so hard to trust yourself, because your internal experience doesn't match the external feedback you're getting from the world. And that's where comments like, you don't look neurodivergent or you're cosplaying can hit so deeply, because they're not just about that moment. They are reinforcing a lifetime of being misunderstood, a lifetime of being told that what you're experiencing isn't real or isn't enough or isn't valid. I think one of the most important implications of this research and this conversation is that we need to expand our understanding of what neurodivergence actually looks like, because it doesn't always look like visible struggle. Sometimes it looks like overcompensation. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism. Sometimes it looks like being highly self-aware but still overwhelmed. Sometimes it can look like holding everything together until you can't anymore. And if we only validate neurodivergence when it's obvious, then we are going to continue missing people. We are going to continue invalidating people, and we are going to continue creating environments where people feel like they have to prove their experience in order for it to count. And if you're listening to this and something in your body is like, yeah, Like that quiet knowing that maybe you've been trying to explain something your whole life and just didn't have the language for it. I just want to say you're not alone in that. And I also want to take a second to say hi and welcome some of the new people who have found their way here recently. I've noticed a little bump in listeners, and I'm just really glad you're here, truly. This space means so much to me. It's something I've built from the ground up as a single neurodivergent mom who is just trying to make sense of her own brain while healing from narcissistic abuse and also creating a space where other people can feel a little less alone in their experiences. And if you've been listening and you feel supported here or seen here, or like something is finally clicking for you, the best way to support this mission is by subscribing to my Patreon. It's between $1 to $5 a month, or you can subscribe for free, and it directly supports me in being able to keep showing up, keep creating, and keep building this into something bigger, a space where we can actually normalize the neurodivergent experience and create more nervous system safety in the way we live, the way we parent, and the way we exist in the world. If this episode resonates with you, I would also really encourage you to share it with someone, because chances are, if this hit for you, there's someone in your life who has felt this too, but maybe hasn't had the words for it yet. Before we close out, we're going to do our little journal prompt for the week. So here it is. Where in my life have I been dismissing my own experience because it didn't look valid enough to other people? And if you feel like going a little deeper, if I trusted myself fully without needing external validation, what would I allow myself to acknowledge? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have the perfect answer. You don't have to solve it. Just notice what comes up. And before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with this. If someone needs you to struggle louder in order to believe you, that says more about their understanding than it does about your reality. You are allowed to understand yourself. You are allowed to name your experience. And you are allowed to take up space, even if it doesn't look the way people expect it to. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you lovies next week. Ta-ta!